Commissioner Just,
Present.
Commissioner Peterson,
Present.
Commissioner Rosenberry, and Commissioner Rosenberry, I believe, will be here just a little bit late. Commissioner Whips,
Present.
Commissioner Will, not seeing yet. Vice Chair Monteblanco,
Present.
and Chair Mori Bidu.
Present.
Thank you. We have 7 commissioners present.
Thank you.
Real quick,
Next on the
Commissioner Carlson is online, just so we're noticed.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, next on the agenda is the director's report. May we please have the director's report?
Thank you, Chair Mori Badu. And just to let folks know that joining us this evening is Senior Assistant County Counsel Jacqueline Saito, who is joining us in the absence of Vamshi Reddy. She'll be here for council liaison during tonight's meeting. Yesterday, the Board of County Commissioners held the first hearing on engrossed Ordinance 908, which is the Metro Town Center and Regional Center boundaries. The board voted 4-0 to order engrossment of that ordinance. We need to make some minor adjustments around the regional center map. They didn't want us to show the city extents, the portion of that regional center that are in the cities of Tigard and Beaverton. And so they ordered engrossment. And so that'll be coming back later in December 9th, and then a second public hearing on January 6th. And then looking later into January, we have 2 Planning Commission member terms that are ending on January 26th. We've been notified by Commissioner Will that he is not interested in renewing his term on the Planning Commission, and so there will be a recruitment announced in the very near future. So if you know of anyone that might be interested in serving on the Planning Commission, we'd certainly appreciate you sharing that information within your networks, and we'll be posting that online. And Chair Mori Badu has expressed her interest and will be reapplying for another term on the commission. We have I'm trying to think. Ordinance hearing is scheduled to come before the Planning Commission at our first meeting in January. And so these are very important hearings. And so just to remind everyone, it comes a little bit early in the month on January 7th. So if you could all make reminders of the importance of that Planning Commission meeting and make sure to attend if at all possible. And then also coming up in February is the time in which we elect and install the chair and vice chair. So that first meeting of February is on the 4th. And so if you're interested in serving in either one of those positions, please keep that in mind, and we'll be holding the elections on at that meeting. For today's meeting, we have first a work session. So Suzanne Sabin will be here to present an update on our Community Development Code Assessment Project. And then we'll have the first hearing for 2 ordinances. Actually, we'll be doing an overall presentation because the 2 ordinances are very interrelated. It's the urban planning area agreements for both the cities of Cornelius and Forest Grove. And then we'll have to hold technically separate public hearings for each item and have a separate recommendation for each item. And then in terms of upcoming meetings, staff is proposing that we cancel the December 3rd meeting. We'd hope to be able to discuss the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, but that final rulemaking has not quite yet been released. So we're proposing to cancel that. And we currently don't have any items on deck for December 17th. But then, as we mentioned, January 7th, we have those ordinances coming up on the accessory dwelling units, the hearing on the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and that will be a daytime meeting. So January 7th at 1:30 p.m. So that completes my director's report. Happy to answer any questions.
Do commissioners have any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda is public communication. Has anyone signed up to speak on matters not on the agenda?
No one has signed up to speak on matters not on the agenda. We do have some attendees online. I will give you all a chance to raise your virtual hand. Does anyone want to communicate to the commission? I'm not seeing any hands, so we can move on.
Thank you very much. Next on the agenda is our first work session, the Community Development Code Assessment Project.
Thank you, Chair Moribadu and Commissioners. The last time that we gave a briefing about this project was in April, and a lot has happened since then. So this is the CDC assessment project where we're going to be taking a comprehensive look at our community development code. And since April, we had in May a series of stakeholder focus group discussions with different stakeholders who use the development code and got some initial feedback from them. And we've also had 2 technical advisory committee meetings. So we've started to get feedback from our technical advisory committee. And this briefing is going to describe some of those things that have already happened and then talk about the information that you got in your packet for this meeting and then the next steps. And we plan to have another briefing on this with the Planning Commission in February. So I'm going to be providing the project orientation part of this presentation, so the first part, and then sections 2 through 5, the consultants that are assisting us with this project, Rachel Cotton and Jamin Kimmel with Cascadia Partners are going to be stepping through those parts of the presentation. So this is just a reminder, since we haven't spoken for about like 6 months now, kind of backing all the way out to what is the Community Development Code. And back in May, Senior Planner Ann Elvers with our current planning section gave the board, the Planning Commission a work session briefing on the Community Development Code, but I'm going to touch on a few of the things that she shared just as a reminder. So the CDC is part of our comprehensive plan, and it contains the standards that regulate urban and rural development in the county. And it's made up of 7 articles. Probably the 2 that are the most sort of substantive or I guess meaty articles are Article 3, which describes all of the county's land use districts, and Article 4, which has the development standards that apply to land uses and developments. So I'm going to touch on those in a little more detail. So with Article 3, the land use districts, the county has both urban land use districts, and these apply to properties that are within the urban growth boundary. And they include districts that are purely residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, and mixed use. And we also have the North Bethany sub-area. And then the rural land use districts apply to properties that lie outside the urban growth boundary. And we've got residential, commercial, and industrial districts. And we've also got 3 districts that are called resource districts: exclusive forest conservation, agriculture and forest AF20, and exclusive farm use. And those last 3 districts, the development standards that apply to them are largely come down to us from the state. So the state requirements get translated into our code. Article 4, the development standards, has quite a variety of standards that apply to developments. So we've got landscaping requirements and requirements for signs, floodplain standards, and significant natural resource area regulations. And members of the PC that were here last year when we were doing our significant natural resource update probably remember us talking a lot about Section 422, which is the significant natural resource regulations. We also have a large section 430 special use standards, and these are additional development standards that apply to very specific uses in the code. And then we also have transit-oriented design standards and variances and non-conforming use standards. So Article 3 and 4 basically come into play with almost every development application the county receives. So as background on the project, I think back in April, I showed a slide that had a picture. It was a photograph of the Community Development Code lying on a food scale because we weighed it. It was so thick. It weighs a little more than 6 pounds. It was adopted originally in 1983. And we have added to it over the years, and we've also subtracted things from it over the years. But the additions have far outweighed the subtractions, and we've never taken a comprehensive look at it to see what needs to be updated basically since 1983. So we received grant funding from the Department of Land Conservation and Development to assess our community development code. We knew that we would need consultant help to do that. And so we have Cascadia Partners as the consultants that are assisting us with this project. And the goals are to ensure that the code complies with various state requirements that we'll be touching on in a few minutes. Also is intended to remove obstacles to housing development and also to streamline the code to make it easier for both members of the public and staff to use. And so this assessment is basically going to be a report about where we are with the code. So it's a first step in updating the code. Actual ordinances to amend the code will come later. So this is the project team. I don't think I even introduced myself before I started talking, but I'm the senior planner with community planning, Suzanne Savin, and I'm acting as the project manager. And then Teresa Cherniak, our principal planner, Ann Kelly, senior planner, and Cassie Brown, associate planner, are also the county members of the project team. And then for Cascadia Partners, Rachel Cotton is acting as the project manager, and she's going to be giving a part of this presentation and a little later. Jamin Kimmel is the partner, and Lydia Ness is the senior associate that are helping us with this. So the scope of the project, it's going to result in 2 deliverables. The first deliverable is the CDC audit or CDC assessment report. And this is going to be a report that describes sort of the current state of the CDC, what the sort of issues are that could be addressed to make it easier to use, meet legal requirements, remove barriers to housing. So it's going to be sort of a list of things to do. And then the priorities report is going to come after the CDC audit is completed. The priorities report is going to look at those things to do and prioritize what order they should be done in and how they should be packaged together, because we will probably have to approach these changes in a series of ordinances, and we need some structure around which changes should come first, which changes should come later. So on the project timeline, the last time that we spoke with the Planning Commission was back in April. So the project was basically just starting. And since then, under the public and stakeholder engagement, there have been a couple of things that have happened. So in May and June, we had a series of 10 stakeholder focus group discussions with various groups of stakeholders who use the development code regularly or have interest in the community development code. And I'll be talking about who those stakeholders were and some of the comments they shared in a few slides from now. Another thing that happened in June is we had our first technical advisory committee meeting, and that's what the green star symbolizes. And I'll be sharing a slide in a second showing who our TAC members are. Commissioner Rosenberry is on our technical advisory committee representing the Planning Commission. We also then in October had a second technical advisory committee meeting, and now we're on that red diamond, the Planning Commission briefing. The other thing that's been happening is that the consultants have started their CDC audit. So that's the gray bar that's in the second row there. They started that back in May, looking at the various sections of the Community Development Code and flagging for staff and having discussions with staff about things that they were finding. And based on those early findings, they've started to draft their CDC assessment report. And what you received in your packet for this meeting was probably the thickest part of your packet was basically kind of an early draft of that report that addresses some of the topics that the full report will ultimately address, but it doesn't have all of the topics that the full report will ultimately address. But it's sort of a check-in point so that you can see what we're finding so far and maybe offer some comments or questions about what you see that we're finding so far. And looking out in the future a little bit, we're going to be having another technical advisory committee meeting in January. And at that meeting, at that point, there will be probably a full draft report of the CDC audit that we'll be sharing with the technical advisory committee, and then likely sharing that also with the Planning Commission at a February work session. We will then have an open house in March to share these findings with the public, and we will be then having another technical advisory committee meeting, and then checking in with the Board of Commissioners, and then lastly checking in with the Planning Commission again toward the end of the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the pieces of community engagement that happened since we last talked with you in April. So we had 2 technical advisory committee meetings, and I'll be showing you who those folks are in a moment. We also had 10 focus group discussions, and I'll be talking a little bit about that in a moment as well. So these are our technical advisory committee members, and they represent representatives of the home builders, of affordable housing developers, of various agencies and local governments. And there's also the county engineers on our technical advisory committee, and of course, Commissioner Rosenberry with the Planning Commission. So we've got a pretty good mix of people with different perspectives. Regarding the focus group discussions, we had 10 focus group interviews in May and June, and these were with groups of 3 to 5 people each. And so we had meetings with community representatives and market rate developers and home builders, and housing advocates and nonprofit developers, county leadership, the county planners in current planning that currently have to implement our community development code, and staff in our building and engineering departments that also are impacted by our code, and service agencies. And I'm going to share sort of some of the comments that they offered about the community development code. The questions that we asked, basically these discussions were led by our consultant, and there were usually a series of 4 to 5 questions that were asked to kind of generate discussion at these focus group discussions. And in some cases, the questions overlapped, but in some cases, the questions were kind of tailored at the stakeholders that we were addressing. So with the home builders and developer representatives, we got some sort of, to staff, some surprising feedback, because one of the questions was, what about the community development code do you find difficult to use? And interestingly, the developer representatives, several of them said that our code was their favorite code of all the community development codes in the region, which we didn't expect to hear anybody saying anything good about it. So that was kind of interesting. And one of the reasons that they were saying that, it made sense after the fact, was that the representatives that we were interviewing, we had chosen them in part because we knew they were familiar with our code, that they'd worked with our code and could comment on it. But because they had such familiarity with our code, because they've used it so much, and because they've also are familiar with other jurisdictions' codes, to them, it's kind of like putting on a pair of slippers. I mean, it was sort of like they find it very comforting. And they said to us that one of the things they liked about the community development code is the fact that it only has kind of a 2-level hierarchy. So it's got articles and code sections, and there's not a lot of nesting of topics, and multi-tiered nesting of topics. So if they need to find a topic, like if they need to find out what the lighting standards are, they commented that it was pretty easy for them to know how to get to that in the code, and that other jurisdictions and cities' codes were sometimes a little more intricate and maybe harder to dive into than our code was. But they did point out some requirements that they said added to their project costs and potentially hindered development. So they pointed to some CDC standards that are in the code, and they also pointed to some processes, application processes in the code. And sort of in a direct contrast, when we were speaking with the community representatives, we got pretty different comments. And the community representatives are generally coming to the code from a totally different perspective. They're coming because they're trying to figure out if they can either do something on their property, and it's sort of a one and done approach. They're not using the code regularly. They're just coming to see if this one thing they want to do, if they can do it, or if they're a member of a community participation organization, maybe they're trying to evaluate a development application that's happening in their neighborhood and figure out whether they should be concerned about it or not. So they're trying to find sort of the parts of the code that apply and what they should be keying in on. And their comments were that they felt the code was less than transparent and that it was difficult sometimes for them to find what they were looking for and to figure out what was applicable, what the standards were that were applicable. They offered some suggestions that they thought would improve the accessibility of the code and make it so that people could find what they were looking for. And then the housing advocates and nonprofit developers, they'd commented sort of from the get-go that they don't do much multifamily development in the county. And so they didn't have a lot of collective experience that they could provide. And they commented that the costs of developing a 5-story or more building often precluded development given the densities that could be achieved in the county's land use districts and the rents that could be achieved. So basically it sort of hasn't worked out or penciled out for them to do much in the county, but they were interested in finding out more about our code, and they were giving some feedback about what they feel allows them to work better with some of the other development codes, like City of Beaverton, for example. The county planners that we spoke with, these are our planners that work primarily in current planning. So they're the planners that actually receive development applications and then have to make decisions about them based on what the code criteria is. And they had a lot to say about the code, and they thought there was the potential to maybe consolidate some of the county's land use districts, not have as many distinct land use districts. And they also commented that the formatting right now in Article 3, if you were to look at any specific land use district, like I'm just going to say, for example, if you were going to look in the R9 residential land use district and you wanted to find out what the allowed uses are in R9, what you'd see in that chapter is that the uses are laid out in a series of lists. So there'll be one list about the land uses that are allowed through a type 1, fairly simple application process. And there'll be another list of the uses that are allowed through a type 2 process that requires more staff discretion, but it does not require going to a hearing. And then a third list of uses that could be allowed if you go through a public hearing. So it's sort of hard to wade through 3 lists of text. They're on kind of going through multiple pages. And they commented that it would be a lot simpler to have maybe one table where you list all the uses and have a column that indicates what kind of land use district it should be in. So they just thought there were some formatting things that would make it a lot easier to see things and figure things out more at a glance. And then they pointed out some things that they thought, some community development code provisions that they thought contributed to housing inequities that we thought were interesting. So that was good feedback. And we met with county leadership Some of their feedback overlapped with some of the county planners' feedback in that they also thought that the land use districts might have the potential to be consolidated, and that the formatting of the code has a lot of potential to be modernized to use tables instead of long lists of text. I think leadership is also looking at this from how easy is it for staff to get trained up on the community development code when we hire new planners? How long does it take them to learn the code? And the fact that our code is so thick and maybe not as well organized as it could be contributes to a steeper learning curve than need be. And it would be better if it was a simpler code so staff could get up to speed with it more quickly. So our second TAC meeting happened relatively recently. And at that second technical advisory committee meeting, the main information that we shared with the TAC was pretty much the same information that's in your packet. It was a draft CDC assessment progress report that showed some findings for a couple of the areas that we're studying through this assessment. And the feedback that we got at that meeting is that TAC members thought that so far the issues had been captured fairly well with the report, and that there was support for streamlining and simplifying the CDC to make it easier to use. The part of the report that is still being worked on and was not included in your packet, and it's probably the part that's going to be interesting to the largest number of people, I think, is the discussions of barriers to housing. And so that our consultants and us are working on that section now. And so that information, or that more complete report, will be shared with the Planning Commission probably in February and with our TAC in January. So with that as sort of an overview, I'm going to pause and just see if anybody has questions about this part of it, about just the project orientation, before I hand this over to our consultants to talk about the other pieces of the report that they've worked on so far.
Thank you, Ms. Savin. Do commissioners have questions? Vice Chair Monteblanco?
Thank you. I love this update, and it's so exciting to see how the county can live out its values in this document around ensuring more of what we say we want, right? So slide 10, you mentioned incorporate accessibility best practices, and I'm curious what that means. I have some assumptions, but that's not fair. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be coming out in our barriers to housing section that is still being written, and actually maybe our consultants might have some comments about that as we keep going with the presentation. Yeah.
I'll listen for it. One more question. Yep. In slide 18 and 19, you mentioned the potential to consolidate land use districts. Is that a thing? Is that like a 5-year plan? Is that I don't have a sense of what that would take.
Yeah, that'll also probably be touched upon a little bit in one of the upcoming slides, and no, that's totally fine. I think there's going to be a graphic too that kind of shows it, but there are a couple different ways to maybe approach consolidation right now, and the consultants will talk more about this, so I don't want to steal their thunder, but right now we have a separate section for each individual land use district. And we don't necessarily have to organize the code in that way. We could have a section that talks together about 3 different land use districts that are kind of similar and kind of groups them together. We don't have to have each of them pulled out. Because by pulling them out the way the code does currently, it basically adds a lot of repetition that doesn't need to be there, because even if 2 residential land use districts have different allowed densities, there's still other things about those districts that have the same standards, and we're having to repeat ourselves a lot. So that's one way that,
like a flow chart, an epic flow chart.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way that is we could maybe organize it a little differently to reduce repetition. But another way, which is more of a policy decision, which will have a lot more issues associated with it, is actually collapsing some land use districts, like saying that R5 and R6 should just be R low or something like that, and sort of collapsing it. But there's more policy stuff to figure out with that as an option. And we haven't figured that out yet. So that's just you'll see on I think an upcoming slide where that'll get touched on a little bit more.
Thank you.
Commissioner Carlson.
So I guess my question is two things. What is an action step that you're like, are we looking to condense this, or I realize we're trying to clarify it, but are we trying to condense it by a 20%, 30%, or and what is the action step that you need from us? Are we just to nod our head if we think you're going in the right direction? And then the third question would be regarding the discussions of barriers to housing and the equity goals. Will we see a communications plan? Because I think that's, if you get good data and do good outreach, you get really good, thoughtful impact, or thoughtful, it's going to become good policy probably. So I guess I'd love to know what that looks like, because that's the place I probably have more questions and concerns than probably the technical aspects.
Right. Well, in terms of actions, I don't think we have like a metric where we are coming in saying we think the code should weigh 3 pounds less than it does and be 60% smaller. We don't have any kind of metric like that. We'd like to get it. We would certainly like to get it to be more compact. But we first just needed to see what we were dealing with. And so that CDC assessment report / audit is going to help us see what we're dealing with and maybe help us then figure out what the answer to that question is. With regard to like what we're asking for tonight, it's basically trying to just get the Planning Commission a little bit caught up with this project, since the last time we spoke with you is before we'd even really started it. And so we're just catching you up on what we've been working on so far, what kind of feedback we've gotten so far, and see if you have any comments or questions on what we've done so far, or the findings that you got in your draft packet. Again, we will be coming back to the Planning Commission for another work session in February, and at that point, we'll be providing you with a more complete draft CDC audit report that will also be talking more about the barriers to housing piece. And I know that you're right that is going to be the most substantive piece. When we spoke with the TAC in October, and we let them know that we would be bringing that more complete report, including the barriers to housing piece, to them in January, their comment to us, or a couple of the TAC members' comment to us, was normally our practice is to give the technical advisory committee the packet like a week ahead, sort of like we would do with the Planning Commission. We give the packet a week ahead. And one of our TAC members is from the Fair Housing Council, and he said because what you're going to give us for January is going to include the barriers to housing piece, he said, I really want to shop that around to my network, so I'm hoping you can get that out 2 weeks ahead of the TAC meeting, so I can start sort of shopping it around and seeing if my network has any comments about it. And so we are aiming to do that, to get that information out to the TAC for them to look at 2 weeks ahead of the meeting. And that way, people that are on the technical advisory committee, the various members, can like talk about it with their networks. And once we give something to the technical advisory committee, we email it, and we also post it on our project webpage, it becomes public at that point. So the Planning Commission could take a look at it at that point too. If you were curious, it's going to be posted. And again, we'll be giving the Planning Commission a copy of the complete draft report too, prior to the February, the check-in that we have with you. And we're still strategizing other ways to sort of get out the word on that piece of it, because we know that piece of it is the biggest piece of it.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Okay. Well, I guess at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Rachel Cotton. So she's the project manager on our consultant side with Cascadia Partners to talk about the legal compliance audit summary part of the CDC progress report.
Thank you, Suzanne, and good evening, commissioners. My name is Rachel Cotton. I'm a senior associate at Cascadia Partners. We are an urban planning consulting firm based in Portland, and Jamin and I and others on our team work on code-related kind of diagnostics, like we've done here, audits and updates throughout Oregon and also across the country. And so, as Suzanne mentioned, there are three main components to the audit. There is the legal compliance portion, the streamlining and usability portion, and the barriers to housing portion. And so tonight we're providing an update that is essentially a summary of the materials you received in your packet related to the legal compliance portion as well as the streamlining and usability portion. So shown here is a summary of findings. The state of Oregon has rolled out a number of requirements related to housing allowances, and the staff have kept up with many of these and made related amendments, but there are a few areas in which additional amendments are needed to comply with the requirements of the state statute. And so what we see shown here, there were some middle housing related bills in 2019 that the CDC is in compliance with. And then there are some other statutory requirements related to manufactured homes, occupancy of recreational vehicles, residential homes and facilities that the CDC partially complies with. As one example, manufactured homes must have the same siting and design standards that apply to single detached dwellings. And so that is an amendment that's needed within the CDC. In addition, there are some new requirements as a result of legislation that passed this year related to middle housing and middle housing land divisions that will necessitate additional amendments. And I'll cover those in more detail in the next slide. And then there are some areas in the CDC related to manufactured home parks, as well as single room occupancies that the CDC will need additional amendments to come into compliance with. Currently, there is no definition or allowance for single room occupancies in the CDC, and this is as a result of state legislation. This needs to be included. So that's one thing that our team is working on. Next slide. And so as mentioned, there were some big housing related bills passed in the legislative session. And these include some new requirements related to middle housing land divisions, SROs, as mentioned, promoting housing density, engineering review timelines, and design standards that relate to residential development, among other things. This is just a brief list. And when the legislature passes new laws related to land use planning, the Department of Land Conservation and Development goes through the rulemaking process. In some cases, the statutes need additional interpretation, and that can take time. So there are different dates that some of the requirements for these statutes go into effect in. Some, like the middle housing land division requirements, go into effect immediately. Others go into effect in 2027 and others go into effect in 2028. And one thing we are producing as part of the CDC assessment summary report that will be in the final version is a list of what each of the requirements are and then when the effective date is to help staff have a better sense of when those changes will be needed. And DLCD will complete its rulemaking by January 1st, 2028. But it's sort of, as you might imagine, it's a work in progress. Some of the things are needing updates sooner, and so it requires a fair amount of coordination with the rulemaking process to keep up. But the staff will provide an additional update to the Planning Commission in 2026 in February, just to give you a better sense of kind of what are the detailed requirements and then when do they go into effect. In addition, there is a requirement by state law to adopt clear and objective standards, conditions, and procedures when regulating housing development. So that includes things like development standards, like a height and setback requirements, design standards, and also land use application approval criteria. And when we say clear and objective, that means standards that provide definitions or measurements to ensure that there is clear and consistent interpretation of them. So two people can look at the standard and they will have the same interpretation of what it means. Things that you sometimes see in codes like complementary to, enhance, or in harmony with are discretionary. They're not clear and objective. And so those are not considered to meet this requirement. There is an option for alternative approval as long as there is a clear and objective pathway for all types of housing. Next slide. And so as part of this audit that we've been working on with the staff, we've flagged a number of sections of the CDC that will likely need amendments to make them clear and objective. And our team is working on determining the specific changes that are needed to do that, as well as the kind of order of magnitude of those changes. And those listed were some examples of some sections that we found some issues related to clear and objective standards within. And I'm going to pause and ask if after reviewing the materials in your packet related to this statutory compliance review, or based on the presentation so far, if you have any questions about our review or any of the recent bills.
Commissioners have questions? I
Okay.
think we can move on. Yeah.
Well, hearing none, I'm going to turn it over to Jamin Kimmel from our staff to talk about the streamlining and usability related findings of our work so far.
Hi, good evening, Commissioners. Jamin Kimmel, I'm a partner with Cascadia Partners. Pleased to be with you tonight, and yeah, looking forward to some future conversations on this and really digging in. So I'm going to cover some of our findings in a little more detail related to how the CDC is organized and the opportunities we've identified to reduce some of the unnecessary complexity in the code, make it easier to use, and even make it easier for staff to administer and get trained up on, as Suzanne alluded to. And so I want to clarify as we move into this section, many of the opportunities we're identifying would not necessarily require that the change involve a change in policy or a substantive change in the standards or regulations that would apply to development. So many of these changes could be implemented in a way that we might call policy neutral. And so you could modify, reorganize, simplify the code without really substantively changing many of the standards that apply. And so in some cases, that line is blurry, and there may be instances where reorganizing the code would result in a substantive change. But many of these things are changes that could be made without really changing the substance of what the code requires. And why are we focused on this as part of this effort? So we know that codes that are more difficult to use can present barriers for less experienced applicants, for the public to use the code. We also know that having redundancy or inconsistencies in the CDC can slow down the time that staff can review applications and sort of get permits through the process. And we just know there's opportunities really to simplify how the CDC is organized, clarify standards, and make it more usable. Next slide. So the first sort of, excuse me, higher level finding we have is that the way that the code organizes permitted uses and presents what uses are permitted in each land use district is somewhat fragmented and cumbersome to use. And so Suzanne really described it well in that one of the problems in that is that the uses are organized by how what the review process that applies to the use and not by the use itself. And so if you just want to know what is the applicable review procedure or standards for use, makes it hard to find that. Another issue related to that is how the code defines and classifies uses. And so the graphic here on the right shows sort of an example of that from a typical land use district. And the uses as they're currently classified can be relatively narrow. And so an example here of those three uses of financial services, medical and health services, and service businesses. In most land use districts, those are regulated in the same manner. And so it begs the question, could we just have a simpler category to use for all of these uses, which have similar impacts and really are regulated the same way? And so that's one relatively straightforward way. And we might call that going from a classification of uses into a system of use categories. And alongside that, that could be implemented in a way that each of those use categories would have a clear description and definition and some guidance for how to determine what specific uses should be classified into that use category. Another related opportunity here would be to organize the uses within the land use districts by those use categories rather than by the procedure type that applies to them, organize them in tables. So it's really just easier to look up and quickly identify what are the applicable standards for a use category. Next slide. So another issue that Suzanne alluded to was that the CDC is organized in a way that has relatively repetitive sections for each land use district. So each land use district has its own section, which means that in Article 3 in the CDC, which has all of the land use district sections, there's just a large number of sections, and it's a lot to get through, and it's also requires that there are a number of standards and regulations that are redundant throughout many of those sections. This not only makes the code less easy to navigate and use, it also makes it more time-consuming and difficult to amend the code. And so if you're changing one standard that is repeated across multiple land use districts, the staff need to make sure that they've amended each of those districts in the same way. And it really just adds a lot of time and complexity to any code amendment. So some ways that this could be addressed, and there's two sort of general approaches here. So one way would be to group some of those land use districts into sections that are of broader categories. So that approach would we would call sort of policy neutral. So the sense is, let's reorganize the information into a smaller number of sections. So for example, rather than having a section for R5, R6, and R9, 3 land use districts, you have a low density residential districts section because a lot of the standards are the same for them. So that's largely a reorganizing information in a way that's easier to use. Another way that could be implemented, which may be appropriate if the policy direction from the county is to regulate land uses more similarly across districts, is that actually to consolidate the districts on the map rather than to collapse the distinction between different land use districts. And this is perhaps more appropriate now in the context that many of those, especially low density residential districts, by state law, have the same standards applied to all middle housing types, and they're not relatively different across those districts. And so that has, in one way, sort of has washed out some of the distinction between those districts that there was before. And so there may be an opportunity there to both simplify the code, but also to potentially advance a policy direction, which is to perhaps allow a wider variety of housing types and densities across the county in different land use districts. Now, that would really require a policy decision and a direction to move towards allowing housing, particularly housing at a higher density is likely. Go to the next slide. One particular issue that we noticed is that there are similar kinds of particularly design and some development standards that are up here in multiple sections of the code. And so the graphic on the right is a sampling of some of those sections that have design and development standards that are relatively similar. Today, they apply in different districts slightly differently, or maybe they're mostly the same, but they modified slightly for different districts. And this creates just a lot of complexity in the code. Some of those standards are redundant and really could be consolidated in one section rather than repeated in multiple places. And there's another factor here that's potentially could lead the county to look at consolidating design standards that are in multiple places today. And those are two state requirements that are pending or have been passed recently. So the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program will require the county to update some of its design and development standards in order to address statewide goals around supporting more compact, transit-oriented, and walkable development. And so as a part of coming into compliance with those rules, the county may find that standards that only apply in one or a limited number of districts may be necessary to apply more broadly. And so therefore, it may make sense to also consolidate those into a smaller number of sections. Another related change in state law may also require some amendments to design standards, and that is the Senate Bill 974. And what that particularly does is it exempts applying certain kinds of design standards to certain kinds of housing. And so as part of coming into compliance with that law, the county may find that certain design standards that are now only in certain sections here may need to be modified or removed. And so therefore it may make sense to remove that entire section or consolidate it with another section in the code. Go to the next slide. So lastly, requirements associated with what application materials are required and what the processes for submitting a permit are relatively sort of distributed throughout multiple places in the code. And so if an applicant is doing a development and it requires a few different kinds of applications, what the approval criteria are for that application and what materials must be submitted with that application are spread across multiple places, and they are organized a little differently in each of those places. And so some of those more power users of the code may have no problem sort of knowing where all those are and making sure they're complying with all of them. But newer developers, less experienced applicants can find it difficult to identify what are all those various application requirements and how do I know what are the specific approval criteria. And so many other jurisdictions have a consolidated applications chapter, which then presents all the information related to each application in a consistent structure so that if an applicant knows they have these 3 applications they need to submit, they can go to one section, easily find what are the procedures that are required, what do I need to submit as part of my package, and some of the other information. So really just consolidating a lot of the information in one place that's currently scattered across the CDC. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'll pause there. So that's pretty technical information. So I want to see if you have any sort of questions about those initial findings. And also curious, as some of you may be users of the CDC, do you see any other issues about how the CDC is organized that you think make it difficult to use that think weren't reflected in this presentation or in the progress report in your packet?
Mr. Rosenberry.
Thank you, Chair. As someone who has pulled permits in Washington County, not infrequently, my question is related to affiliated agencies. One thing that I found frustrating through the process is I understood Washington County's process, and then all of a sudden the water district had other requirements. And I know that that is not something Washington County is responsible for, but in terms of the clarity and accessibility, I'm wondering who is responsible for helping folks line up the multiple agencies they might have to go through.
Sure, I can just respond sort of with to recognize that we've heard that also from other stakeholders in the interviews we did earlier this year and some members of the TAC. I'm not familiar with sort of the current practice, so I'm going to defer over to Suzanne maybe to comment on how that's handled today.
Yeah, and I might actually defer to Carol because this seems like a question that's a current planning. You're basically, as a development applicant, wondering how this works. I'm aware of the fact that current planning staff, when they meet with folks at the counter, they usually try to direct them and let them know Clean Water Service is going to have some other things. Talk to them first, but I'm not familiar with maybe any formal processes that current planning does. And I don't know if Carol, if you have any comments on that.
Yes, thanks for that question. What we do have information that identifies as the various service providers, like, which water district, are you inside or outside of the THPRD Recreation District? Are you within or outside of the Clean Water Services Service District? But then we really leave it up to the individual applicants to go directly to those agencies and obtain whatever permits or authorization are necessary. And so we typically call those our service provider letters and require that those be submitted as part of the application packet. And we're fairly unique in Washington County in that we have more of those external agencies. We're not a full service county in a way, as you might find in other jurisdictions. And SB 974 is actually providing us with a great opportunity to map out those processes and determine how we can kind of better coordinate the entire development life cycle. There's not to go off on tangent too much, but there's still some outstanding questions in terms of SB 974 and how these new timelines that are embedded in that legislation affect these processes when you have this kind of circumstance. And recent responses from the Housing Accountability and Production Office have said, that was really not addressed in the legislation. There's no rulemaking, and so they really can't provide any guidance on it other than to suggest someone try to promote some legislation to amend 974 and provide some clarity there. So I think that's something that we're currently working on ourselves, and we're participating in a very large working group that was initiated by Clackamas County. But this question has kind of where we've all hit a little bit of a barrier ourselves. It's like, how do we wrap our arms around this situation where you've got kind of an octopus situation?
Yeah, Vice Chair Monteblanco.
Great question and helpful answer. I've actually heard from community members a little bit about service provider letters, and I'm curious, this is probably off topic a little bit, but you brought it up. So I guess I'm curious, and as someone who hasn't interacted with the permit office very often, how they come in, they want to build a housing complex, and then the wonderful staff say, okay, and you're in clean water services and you're in Parks District. Here's their phone number, or here's the form, here's how to fill it out. What's the navigation?
Yeah, basically we give them their contact information. This is their website. This is, where you can go and interface and navigate. We, for THPRD and CWS, we actually have fairly strong relationships, and we have coordination meetings with them on a fairly regular basis. The frustrating part is that we're all using different kind of permitting software, and so there's not a good platform to exchange information. And but we are looking at ways that we could at least give each other access to each other's data, like read-only access, so that we can look up information and help provide that customer support without having to just send somebody off and let them navigate that process on their own.
Commissioner Carlson?
Yeah, I just was kind of wondering, I mean, it seems like the reassessing our code was in the work plan that we had, and we probably would have had to do it anyway because of this legislation. I mean, are these two things, am I right in seeing these two things dovetail? And is there anything that we are expecting coming down the pike that we might want to put special tabs on, knowing that this might be the next section that we need to even modify more depending on what happens in, say, the longer session of 2027. But I guess my other question was, are we just lucky that and planful through staff's work of reassessing this code at a time where we would pretty much have to do it anyway because of the legislation that had been passed?
I'm not sure, Jamin or Rachel, if you're aware of anything that's hasn't come down the pike yet, but that's looming that, sort of hasn't been addressed so far. I guess, Jamin had mentioned in one of the earlier slides about, I'm going to flip back to it. Let's see. Or maybe it was in, trying to remember which was the one that had the CFEC. I think I skipped over it.
2 more slides up.
Is this it?
Next one, the
okay.
design standards.
Oh, great.
There
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that second bullet that talks about CFEC compliance, the CFEC rules were pretty substantial. And one of the things that they required the county and all jurisdictions to do is to eliminate our parking requirements. And we've already done that. That's already happened. But another thing that they require is when jurisdictions update their transportation system plans, they require the jurisdictions to adopt walkable design standards for a lot of their urban area. And so this to me at least, and I think, Jamin had flagged it in this slide, but this to me is going to be a big change that probably in and of itself would have required a big ordinance to do. Because right now, the one district that we have that has some of the standards that I think CFEC would require us to apply more broadly is section 392, the pedestrian oriented mixed use district section. And right now that applies only to 2 districts that are located only in the Aloha area around the vicinity of 185th and TV Highway. So Department of Land Conservation and Development back in January posted a guidelines to these their idea of guidelines for the walkable design standards that CFEC requires and some model code language. But it's going to be a big change for the county to have to go in that direction. Some other jurisdictions are starting to adopt regulations to comply with that right now. Like City of Beaverton is working on adopting regulations to comply with that right now. So to me, that's the big thing that's coming, because the county does plan to update our transportation system plan in the next 3 years. So we will need to then adopt these walkable design standards to comply with the CFEC requirements. And
Suzanne, if I could jump in, I got one
sure.
others that might be helpful to illuminate. So the a new requirement that's not actually new legislation, which I try not to speculate on what legislation might get passed in future sessions, but the legislation that has already been passed and rulemaking just is about to complete is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis process, and that has revised how all cities and counties, and some counties, plan to meet their housing needs and take actions to meet those housing needs. And the county, I believe, is required to comply with the first step in that planning process, which is adopting a housing capacity analysis in 2029, I believe. So it's still a few years off, but that may also result in the need for changes to standards that affect residential development. We don't know what the nature of those will be, and they're intended to respond to an analysis of land supply and housing needs. But that is another thing that could lead the county to make other changes related to things like what housing types are permitted in what districts and at what densities.
Other questions? I have one question at least. With this process, like for the short term, what are the immediate demands that staff and then also the Planning Commission will need to engage in to help the process and complete the process?
I believe we will just want, the purpose of today's work session was simply to catch the Planning Commission up to the work that we've done and show that to you. And I would hope that if you have any thoughts that occur to you later after this meeting, and after you've maybe thought a little bit more about the information in the packet, that you would maybe forward those to staff so we can consider those. And there will be more information for you to react to when we come back to you in February. So that'll probably be maybe an even more important checkpoint, because that will be where we will be laying out some more information about the barriers to housing, and we'll want to get your feedback on that. So that's what I can say so far.
And then if I could just add, Chair Moribdu, we're getting kind of close in terms of the schedule for this project, in terms of identifying items that might go into our work plan, our annual work plan. And so the hope is that, some of the highest priority issues might float to the surface and be readily identifiable, and that could be incorporated into our work plan immediately. And then we could have another item that we, continue to refine and prioritize other actions that might be recommended by this audit. So that's, we're really eager to get the results, and especially the, the kind of the rubric for determining how we should prioritize which issues to tackle first.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to note one more thing as I'm looking at the project timeline again toward the end of the slide here, is that we haven't really talked about the priorities reports, that second report, but there will be a planning commission check-in on that report as well next spring. So that'll be another opportunity for us to get feedback and thoughts from the planning commission about how we've proposed to prioritize items.
And then when it comes to amending the code, does that, do those amendments come before the commission? Okay. Thanks. Any other questions?
Oh, let me just show this last slide. So I think we've already alluded to this, but we're meeting with the TAC again in January. And then again, we'll be coming to the Planning Commission in February, and we'll be sharing that draft summary report ahead of the Planning Commission's briefing. Appreciate meeting with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for all that information. It was really helpful and informational update. The next item on our agenda is the public hearings. The first one is a public hearing on ordinance number 909. Ms. Miller's here to give the staff report. Are you going to do them together?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with the public hearing on 909 and then move on to the public hearing for 910, but we will get the staff report for both of them first.
That's correct. That's correct. Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. I'm Michelle Miller, Senior Planner with Planning and Development Services in Land Use and Transportation. Tonight, I'm sharing the presentation for Ordinance number 909, the County Cornelius Urban Planning Area Agreement, and Ordinance 910, the County and Forest Grove Urban Planning Area Agreement. So because the ordinances are both urban planning area agreements that are somewhat related, the presentation has been combined. However, because they're individual ordinances, a separate hearing is needed for each ordinance. First, I'm going to go over urban planning area agreements in general. Then I'm going to talk a bit about ordinance number 909, the Cornelius UPAA, and talk about the key provisions found within that agreement. And then I'm going to share the ordinance 910 and talk a little bit about the Forest Grove Urban Planning Area Agreement. Then I'm going to share the staff recommendation for 909 and request that we hold the hearing on that ordinance. After the hearing concludes, I will provide the staff recommendation for ordinance number 910 and request that we hold that hearing at that time, as you elaborated earlier. So urban planning area agreements, or with the acronym UPAA, are agreements that the county has with each of the cities in the county, identifying the city's specific urban planning area. Those are the urban unincorporated areas inside the urban growth boundary. And the urban reserve planning areas, those are areas that are eligible to be added to the urban growth boundary at a future date. And the UPAAs provide guidance for coordinating comprehensive planning and development within the planning areas in compliance with state planning goals and law. State law allows local governments to enter into these type of agreements that outline the responsibilities for planning activities within the regional urban growth boundaries. So both Forest Grove and Cornelius are in the metro regional urban growth boundary. Additionally, statewide planning goal 2, land use planning, requires plans related to land use must be consistent with adopted county and city comprehensive plans and regional plans. To this end, in 1983, the county coordinated with all of the cities to develop urban planning area agreements. So they were all adopted at the same time in 1983. Oops. I'll go back. One more thing to say about that. Adopted urban planning areas agreements are included as elements of our comprehensive plan. And over time, amendments are needed to the UPAAs when we expand or modify a city's planning area boundary, or we provide updates to the policies regarding coordination. And updates might be needed to reflect changes in state law or regional land use planning policies. So a little bit about UPAA history. Most UPAAs were adopted at the same time in 1983, and updates have occurred over time as were needed with each individual cities. And since 2017, many UPAAs were updated to modernize notice provisions and improve coordination between the county and cities with respect to comprehensive planning. The urban reserve process prompted changes to include a new section for concept planning in the urban reserve area. Also, the added urban reserve areas were included into the new urban planning area maps that would be planned by each city. So each city would anticipate the urban reserve planning area that they might be responsible for concept planning. Since the original UPAAs with cities, several regional planning related events have created the need to revise most UPAAs. The Urbanization Forum took place in 2009. It brought together cities in Washington County to agree that all future UGB expansion areas would be governed and urbanized by the city rather than unincorporated Washington County. And they agreed to add this type of language to urban planning areas as area agreements as they were amended. The main thing that's changed for the need to revise other UPAAs is the advent of the urban and rural reserve lands. The Oregon legislature validated the urban and rural reserves in Washington County for Washington County, with the county adding the designation to our county maps in 2017. So this map shows the urban reserves areas identified in bright blue. Those are the areas eligible for future urban growth boundary expansions in the long-term planning area, and the rural reserves are identified in green. With the brown areas are rural areas without a reserve designation. So some of the key provisions found in most UPAs include defining the planning roles and responsibilities for the specific planning area and detailing on how we would work together for the to plan for these areas. The UPAAs describe the urban reserve areas and those planning responsibilities, and they were new sections that were added to most UPAAs at the time. And the UPAAs also include a requirement for complying with Metro Urban Growth Management Functional Plan Title 11, which shows what needs to be included for when you create comprehensive plans for these UGB expansion areas. So the county has an interest in making sure that planning for unincorporated areas meets the expectations for road funding, access management, and different services, and also addressing any coordination needs. So tonight's hearings are for the UPAAs for Forest Grove and Cornelius, and this is a map that shows their location on the county for your reference. So next I'm going to speak to Ordinance 909, and it's the Washington County Cornelius Urban Planning Area Agreement. So the Cornelius UPAA is one of our oldest UPAAs in effect without an update. This slide shows the 1988 urban planning area map, and it's the last one to be updated with that includes the urban reserve process that I talked about earlier. The Cornelius UPAA focuses on the changes that are included in Metro Title 11, as well as describing the improved coordination measures for development and comprehensive planning. And we also talk about how we support and coordinate with the cities in these efforts, especially related to transportation planning. Another key piece of the UPAA process is to update the maps and identify where annexations have occurred and other new urban growth boundary expansion areas are included in the new maps to be amended. Ordinance number 909, some of the key provisions are new language related to the coordination of transportation planning activities in the urban planning area. It includes changes related to setting up an agreement for the expectations for road funding, planning for jurisdictional transfers of roadways to the city upon annexation, and access management agreements for county roadways, as well as to make sure that they are in sync with both transportation system plans. Other minor changes to the coordination of planning activities in the urban planning area, like clarifying the expectations with respect to the various service providers. We've removed some outdated provisions related to comprehensive planning provisions, especially regarding like notice and including things talking about adding email, for example. Also, we've added a timeline and a process to follow when the county or city proposes a change to the urban planning area agreement itself. And the 1988 UPAA map is replaced with a new map that reflects the changes that have occurred since 1988. So this map shows those changes with the urban growth boundary expansion areas surrounding Cornelius. The darker yellow areas are the lands that have been added to the planning area since 1988, with the lighter areas, the lands that were either in the Cornelius city boundary or within their urban planning area. This is the original Exhibit A that was filed with Ordinance number 909. You can see that some of the lands added to the urban growth boundary since 1988 from the last slide have already been annexed into the city and are shaded that light gray color. The dark gray areas are Cornelius's urban planning area. The three red circled areas are where minor changes are needed from the originally filed ordinance that I'll be talking about in the next slide. So this is attachment A to the staff report for ordinance number 909. The red circles highlight the corrections that are proposed for engrossment to Exhibit A that was from the originally filed ordinance. Starting at the top left circle, the area is proposed to be added to the urban planning area, and it was not on the filed ordinance map. As well as moving to the next circled area to the right, that area should have included being within the city and instead of the urban planning area. And the circle on the bottom is an area that where we've removed some urban planning area that was incorrectly on a layer that shouldn't be there. Now I'm going to turn to ordinance number 910. That's the Forest Grove Urban Planning Area Agreement. Because the Forest Grove UPAA was updated more recently, the changes with ordinance 910 are very minor. Primarily, we're looking at being consistent with the Cornelius Urban Planning Area Agreement. We removed some notice provisions and provisions that are no longer applicable. We've simplified some wording and to be consistent with the Cornelius agreement, as well as removing a small portion of the Forest Grove Urban Planning Area. We've also made changes to the map to reflect recent annexations to the city. So here's the Forest Grove UPAA map from 2018, and it was changed from the 1988 version. It included new agreements for concept planning in the urban reserve lands and also the urban reserves that would be in Forest Grove's planning area. So here's the map of Forest Grove and their urban planning areas shown in dark red. The map also shows the eastern boundary of Forest Grove that's adjacent to the Cornelius city boundary. The 2018 Forest Grove UPA map included lands within Forest Grove's urban planning area that extended north of Forest Grove to Council Creek area. So that kind of squiggly line there, that's Council Creek. During the update to the 2018 map, it was anticipated that the areas east of Forest Grove would ultimately be included in Cornelius's urban planning area by extending the long-established boundary northward between the two cities when the updates occurred with the Cornelius UPAA. The circled area on this map shows the area I'm going to be talking a little bit more in detail on the next slide. So this slide shows the zoomed in area at the northeastern edge of Forest Grove that's adjacent to Cornelius. The red shades are Forest Grove and their urban planning area, and the yellow shaded area are Cornelius's boundary and the brighter urban planning area in yellow. The outline of the 16-acre parcel is shown here. You can kind of see the outline. It looks like a L, kind of a laying down L. And it spans both Forest Grove and Cornelius. The area in green is outside of the urban growth boundary. The arrow points to the 2.7 acres that are proposed to be removed from Forest Grove's urban planning area. We worked with Forest Grove and they agreed that the property would best be served by one jurisdiction, in this case, Cornelius. So the map proposes so the UPAA map update for Forest Grove includes the removal of this portion of the tax lot and incorporates other recent annexations that you can see from this slide. And with that, staff would recommend that we conduct the hearing for ordinance number 909 and recommend approval of the ordinance to the Board of Commissioners with engrossment to include the changes proposed by staff as shown in attachment A of the staff report.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Do commissioners have questions? Commissioner Frey.
On the small tax lot that's being split between or going between Cornelius and Forest Grove potentially here, do we have any testimony from the property owner that's being impacted by that? I'm assuming they've been involved in the process and are okay with whatever's happening with their land or have had some voice in the process.
Right. So they are in agreement with they worked with the Cornelius to study this area, and that portion that was in Forest Grove is also that they want to combine both of to be under one jurisdiction. It would be easiest to serve it under one jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions? Okay, so at this point, I think we will move on to opening the public hearing for ordinance 909. Clerk Brown, do we have any community members sign up to testify?
Thank you, Chair. We have no one signed up in advance to testify. Would anyone joining online wish to testify to the Planning Commission on this matter? We do have someone here. One moment. Please go ahead. The Washington County CCI.
Good evening.
If you could state your name.
This is Bruce Bartlett. I am the chair of the Washington County Committee for Community Involvement, and I've been watching the meeting and enjoying the exchanges a lot. One thing about the urban planning area agreements is the public participation in the process of changing the boundaries. And I'm not clear on what the public participation process would be when land is proposed to be brought out of the urban reserves into a city, because it affects both the county and the city. And it's the crux of the question is, can somebody in a county resident comment on the city's portion of the transfer of the property, or can county residents that don't live in the city only comment on the county's portion? And so that is not necessarily a question I'm looking to have an answer to, but it's just something that strikes me that I just would like it clarified what the process for public groups to be involved, or county sponsored groups to be involved in this process. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Bartlett.
Is there anyone else that is wishing to testify?
We have no one else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we will close the public hearing and move on to deliberation. What comments do commissioners have about the ordinance? Again, we're on Ordinance 909. Commissioner Rosenberry.
Can I ask for clarity on what Ordinance 909 is specifically about? I know we were presented with 909 and 910. What is 909? Where is the boundary there?
909 is the Washington County Cornelius Urban Planning Area Agreement, and the proposed map. The map is proposed for engrossment. That is the attachment that you have to your staff report. So it's proposed for some changes to the originally filed map, but the urban planning area agreement itself is proposed for recommending approval.
And just to clarify, 910 is the Cornelius Forest Grove exchange in that one tax lot. Am I understanding the distinction?
In part, it includes that change. It includes the removal of that portion of the tax lot from the Forest Grove Urban Planning Area Agreement, but it also includes some changes to the Urban Planning Area Agreement itself with Forest Grove. So and we can talk a little bit more about that recommendation when we have that hearing.
Okay. Do commissioners have additional deliberation or comments about Ordinance 909? Commissioner Rosenberry?
I would like to go back to probably the same question that was being asked earlier. If we could go back a couple of slides, talking about changes to the discussion process.
From Mr. Bartlett? Is that what you're talking
Yes.
about? Sure. So when areas are in the urban reserves, that to add any land to the urban reserve, from the urban reserves to inside the urban growth boundary, is a decision that Metro makes. So when a city may be able to show a need to expand their urban growth boundary for the 20-year planning horizon, so they make application to Metro. Notice would be provided at that time to the property owners in that area, or people tracking that issue. So it's a Metro decision whether to accept that change. For example, we've had some recent ones with Sherwood and Sherwood West. That was an urban reserve area that Sherwood asked to be added to the urban growth boundary. And so it's still not in their city limits yet, but they're they're doing comprehensive planning now based on the approval that Metro gave.
But one thing we kind of glazed over in this is that there were changes to that notification or that hearing process.
So, well, from the agreements that we have with with the various cities, so we try to coordinate and say, oh, the city might be comprehensively planning in an area, and so we try to coordinate with them. With the county would try to coordinate with the city and participate on their committees where they're doing the planning, so that we know about that, and we can take a look at their transportation system plan. Do they have services available? How does that all work? That's one aspect of the coordinating comprehensive planning, but we also coordinate on development review applications too. There might be a new annexation. We would get notice. Does the county have a comment on that? And we just so that we know what's happening and we coordinate. So there's some requirements outlined in the urban planning area agreements that share how we are responsible for letting each other know what's happening in these areas, because we both have an interest in the planning.
Thank you. So if I'm hearing it right, it's a change to communication between agencies, not between agency and the public.
We're just we're modernizing some of those aspects of it to bring it up to 2025 standards and to kind of simplify some of those occurrences. And since for example, the Cornelius urban planning area was so old, we had a lot of things for comprehensive planning that we took out because it's a requirement now that Metro has that. So it's not really needed that we agree to do this or that they agree to do it, because it's something that they need to do per the Metro Title 11. So some of those requirements.
Yeah.
Sure.
Are there any more comments for deliberation? Okay, at this time, I'd like to invite a motion concerning this ordinance. Does any commissioner wish to make the motion? Would you mind switching the slide back to the...
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Happy to make the motion. I move for, I'm going to use the wrong language. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I move to recommend approval of ordinance number 909 to the Board of Commissioners with engrossment to include changes proposed by staff as shown in attachment A of the staff report.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Can we please have a roll call vote?
Yes, Commissioner Carlson let us know that she would need to be leaving, so she's not with us. Commissioner Fry?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Just?
Yes.
Commissioner Peterson?
Yes.
Commissioner Rosenberry?
Yes.
Commissioner Whips?
Yes.
Commissioner Will is absent. Vice Chair Monteblanco?
Yes.
And Chair Mori Bidu?
Yes.
Thank you. We have 8 in favor.
Thank you. Moving on to the public hearing for ordinance 910. Since we've already had the staff report, I think we can move on to commissioner questions. Do we have any specific questions about ordinance 910? Seeing none, we can now open the public hearing. Is there anyone signed up to testify?
We have no one signed up to testify. Would anyone in the audience wish to testify? We have a couple people online. If you would like to testify, please raise your virtual hand. I'm seeing no hands.
Okay, with no one signing up or volunteering to testify. I now close the public hearing for Ordinance 910. We'll move on to deliberation now. What comments do commissioners have about this ordinance? Okay, seeing no comments, I'd like to invite a motion.
I move to recommend approval of ordinance number 910 to the Board of Commissioners.
Is there a second?
Second.
May we have the roll call?
Thank you. Commissioner Fry,
Yes.
Commissioner Just,
Yes.
Commissioner Peterson,
Yes.
Commissioner Rosenberry,
Yes.
Commissioner Whips,
Yes.
Commissioner Will is absent, Vice Chair Monteblanco,
Yes.
Chair Maury Bidou.
Yes.
Okay, we have 7 in favor, and I misspoke on the previous vote. We had 7 in favor at that one as well.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay. At this time, we will move on to consideration of minutes. We will start with the Planning Commission minutes for September 17th, 2025. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Seeing none and without objection, the minutes for September 17th, 2025 are accepted as submitted. We will now move on to the minutes for October 1st, 2025. Are there any corrections to those minutes? Okay, seeing none and without objection, the minutes for October 1st, 2025 are accepted as submitted. Next on the agenda is Planning Commission announcements. Does any commissioner have anything that they would like to share at this time? Okay, well, thank you very much. Next item is adjournment. So without objection, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.